Okay, we're going to go ahead and kick off, and any latecomers can pick up the thread as they join. Thank you ever so much, everybody, for joining us. I'm Greg Phillips with 𝐓𝐡𝐞 Communications. Welcome to the latest 𝐓𝐡𝐞 media briefing. Russia is laying siege to Ukrainian cities, driving more than 2 million people from the country, even as sanctions are putting a squeeze on Russia and its people. Calls for a no-fly zone in the region have raised concerns that such a move could precipitate a third world war. We have two 𝐓𝐡𝐞 experts with us today to discuss the situation in Ukraine and its various ramifications. With us today, once again, is Bruce Jentleson. He is a professor of public policy and political science at 𝐓𝐶, who served in the State Department under Presidents Clinton and Obama, and is author of the Peacemakers, Leadership Lessons from 20th-Century Statesmanship. Also joining us, once again, is Simon Miles. He is an assistant professor in the Sanford School of Public Policy at 𝐓𝐶, where he studies Russia and the former Soviet Union, and he is the author of Engaging the Evil Empire, an account of how Washington and Moscow overcame their differences to end the Cold War. Gentlemen, good morning to you both.
Morning.
Professor Miles, we'll start with you. We can see that Ukraine has offered stiffer resistance to the Russian invasion than was expected. But what's the situation on the ground right now? And what do those events tell us about how much longer Ukraine could hold out before its government is toppled?
Well, I think we're seeing the Russians continuing to pay the price for launching this war with really just a fantastical concept of operations. That is to say, they built their military planning for the beginning and what they thought would be the end of the war on a pretty heady brew of prejudice and really bold assumptions about the Russian military's performance and the Ukrainian military's what they thought would be extremely poor performance. So they started off, to put it very mildly, on the wrong foot, and they're still paying a price for that. But we do see the Russian military starting to adapt on the ground in ways which are positive for them from a military effectiveness standpoint. The South has always been the best front of this war, of the three fronts of this war: the Southern Front, the Eastern Front, and then the Northern Front. That's largely because the Russians had the Ukrainians outnumbered there as their forces launched northwards from Crimea, and they have been able to take advantage of rail networks in order to make their logistics a lot more efficient, moving supplies and also military equipment over rail rather than on the roads. Now, of course, this is also where we've seen, for example, the brutal siege of Mariupol, which is the town on the Sea of Azov, which was made, I think, probably most famous by the brutal Russian strike on a maternity hospital there, but also where there is some speculation about Russian designs on Odessa, which is a major Ukrainian city. There's kind of sporadic chatter about an amphibious landing trying to take the city, which I think would be extremely militarily unwise, as those forces would have no one on the ground to link up with. And so Odessa is probably off the table for a while. On the Eastern Front, we still see, for example, the shelling of Kharkiv, which the Russians are not trying to take at this point. They're just trying to envelop it. Heavy fighting in this area, also very uneven fighting. The Russians here brought into their forces a lot of elements from the militaries, and I kind of use that term in air quotes, of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, which are pretty ragtag. And that means that here we've seen some pretty effective Ukrainian counterattacks pushing back Russian advances. But the main Russian goal here in the east is to try to encircle the bulk of the Ukrainian military, which is in that area, what was called the Joint Forces Operation, which was the Ukrainian military operation against the Russian-backed separatists there. But most famous is probably the Northern Front on Kyiv, where logistics have been the biggest problem. That's because the Russians have not been able to make use of rail networks, so they've had to truck everything over land south from Belarus. They also launched forward, right? They launched not from Russian territory, so they probably had some issues with depots and kind of initial logistical things there. They're trying to encircle Kyiv. We're seeing that urban fighting in places like Irpin, Bucha, Gostomel, etc. on the west. They're trying to make their way around eastward, not entirely successfully. The south of Kyiv remains open and accessible. There's some signs of successful Ukrainian counteroffensives, in particular in the north. A battle for Kyiv would be not in Russia's favor, I think it's important to say. Not only is urban terrain extremely, extremely favorable for a defender, especially in the context of a pretty unmotivated army like Russia's right now. Morale is pretty terrible. The Ukrainian defenders will be able to use, of course, the higher ground from apartment buildings and things like that, but also an enormous underground network. Not only the subway, but also, and anyone who's spent time in Kyiv, like I have, has been tripped up by these many times, these rabbit warren-like sort of pedestrian underpasses across streets, which provide cover and concealment. So I think what we're looking at is an imminent operational pause on the part of the Russians, who will need to replenish combat ineffective units, resupply things like artillery, where they do seem to be running out of shells. They've started performing better because they're moving more methodically, as opposed to in small, fast, attempted kind of breakthroughs by detached units. Those were not successful, and they've learned from that. They're using air power at an improving rate, but still it seems like about 200 sorties a day, which is not really much to write home about. And they still have big problems with their fundamentals: fatigue, morale, can't fight at night, logistics, not really doing reconnaissance. So the Ukrainians are still taking fewer casualties. The Russians are trending towards 10% out of actions. And the Ukrainians are critically denying the Russians a big combined arms fight. The Russians are set up for that. They're not set up to take on kind of a dozen guys with a lot of anti-tank missiles. Their units are not able to perform well, and they're paying price for that. Nor are they set up for an urban warfare fight.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for that comprehensive overview. Certainly a lot to dig into there, and I want to. But right now, I'm going to move over to you, Professor Jentleson. Professor Miles mentioned the brutality of some of the Ukrainian attacks in Ukraine on civilians in particular, and so that's brought some pressure on NATO and the US to impose a no-fly zone in that area. But obviously, that's kind of complicated. Can you kind of just give us an overview of some of the issues involved there, and why it's not just as simple as imposing a no-fly zone over a region?
Sure. Let me address some of those issues, and we can come back to them as folks like for more detail. You know, it's absolutely understandable in every sense of it that President Zelensky is calling upon NATO to do this in the name of his people who are suffering. And Zelensky, by the way, who many people wrote off as a television comic, sort of like that old Peter Sellers movie, being there that became president, is showing enormous leadership. He's addressing the joint session of the United States Congress today via Zoom. And it actually tells us something about leadership. It's often a match of person and moment. People are calling him Churchillian. It's useful to remember that Churchill wasn't particularly successful in his other leadership roles in Britain during the First World War and elsewhere until World War II, when it was an excellent match of person and moment. And I think that's what we're seeing with Zelensky. So the calls from him, calls from many in the United States and elsewhere, are very heartfelt, but there are a number of problems about doing this. The first really is, as a military operation, this essentially to basically provide the protection that people are calling for. First of all, it have nothing to do with ground artillery and rockets that are coming. It's really about the air, so it wouldn't necessarily solve the humanitarian problem. But it's a very complicated operation. When it was proposed for Syria, a few years back, General Martin Dempsey, who was chief of staff of the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, had said that it would also need 70,000 troops on the ground in order to do it and coordinate. Now, that may have been an overestimation in order to make it look like a less palatable option than to the Obama administration, but there's a point to be made there. It's a very difficult military operation, and some people say, well, hey, we did it over Bosnia in the early 1990s, and we did it over the Kurdish areas of Iraq. You know, it's a bit like saying we succeeded in rebuilding, making democratic Germany after World War II and Japan after World War II. Why couldn't we do it in Iraq in 2003? very different situations. Neither Bosnia nor Iraq was up against a military that, for all of its flaws that my colleague Simon Miles was pointing out quite correctly, is a pretty formidable military. So operationally, this is extremely difficult. Secondly, it pretty much guarantees that there will be a military confrontation, intentional or inadvertent, between American/NATO troops, armed forces, and Russian. So one of the proposals that was put on the table was for a limited no-fly zone. Nobody's really defined what limited is, and is our definition of limited the same as the Russians would accept? I doubt that very much. This is something we have avoided throughout the nuclear age. In 1956, when the Soviets brutally repressed the Hungarian rebellion, there was no military action because it was concerns about that. In 1968, in Czechoslovakia, and throughout the history of the nuclear age, people should not underestimate the risks that are involved in that. The risks of starting to climb the nuclear ladder are very real. And I think that that's why the Biden administration has been clear from even before this happened that we would not directly engage Russian military forces inside Ukraine. It is, of course, with everything going on, people are sort of, let's do something. Can't we alleviate the pain? But the first point is it's very difficult to do. And the second point is the risks are very high. The third point, I think, also is kind of picking up on what Simon said. In some ways, Putin would love to see us do this, right? It would change the dynamic of the conflict to the West, the United States, bearing some responsibility for escalation. It's extraordinary how much global support this has received. I mean, the vote of the United Nations General Assembly, 141-5, it's pretty rare. Even Cuba abstained from that vote. And on the sanctions and everything else, the kind of cooperation that we're getting, this would change the dynamic. We would bear some responsibility for escalation. We could say we're trying to do the right thing, kind of like we said we're trying to do the right thing in Iraq. But in some ways, that would help Putin get out of some of the dilemmas that he's faced, as well as the possibility of shared responsibility for any nuclear escalation at that point. President Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis, was very intentional in trying to avoid that, including resisting the Navy's traditional criteria for where they put up blockades, moving it closer to the Cuban shore so there'd be less chance of a confrontation with the Soviet ships coming in. So all of those are factors. There were a group of us, about 80 of us, had signed on to a letter that was issued in both Politico and The Guardian late last week on why there'd be no fly zone. I'm happy to share the link with anybody that wants to do it. Last point I'll make is, I think, and this picks up on what Simon was saying, one of the basic rules that all military forces face is stabilization is a lot harder than destabilization. And since 2014, the Russians could kind of destabilize Ukraine. They took Crimea, they were active in the east and the Donbass and elsewhere. Putin's goal now is to try to stabilize it. And whether it's the urban warfare that Simon was talking about in Kyiv or elsewhere, he's really in a difficult situation. It doesn't mean that there's not risks that he'll go into NATO or he'll escalate, but the no-fly zone would be very counterproductive. Understandable for President Zelensky to push for it, although I must say that pushing as hard as he is beginning to be problematic for ensuring the cooperation that he needs from the United States and NATO. So those are some factors that make it a very, very dangerous and frankly counterproductive policy option.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. And I've got some follow-up questions on that. At this moment, though, we'll open it up to questions. You can post questions via the Q&A window at any time. And if you'd like to ask a question in person, please raise your hand in Zoom and we'll unmute you when your turn comes around. And if you're calling in by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. Professor Miles, I'd like to come back to you. You mentioned the advantage that Ukraine kind of has in Kyiv because of the urban nature of the warfare. But when we talk about what victory looks like for Russia in Ukraine, does it require conquering Kyiv and bringing down the government and placing a puppet government in place? And if not, are we just looking at drawn-out conflict around Kyiv and bombing elsewhere while the government, the external facing government in Ukraine is still seen to be functioning?
Well, I think the Ukrainians have made it very clear that the Russians' initial war aims, which were basically regime change, are simply not tenable. The world that was conjured up in the mind of Vladimir Putin and the about dozen people who were involved in the war planning effort, and we're learning more and more about just how small that circle was, which is not a good thing when it comes to war planning. That world doesn't really exist anymore, in which they could install a friendly figure, impose that on the Ukrainian people, and turn Ukraine into, if not a client state, then a sort of quasi-neutralized vassal. I think one big challenge, in fact, that the Zelensky government is going to have as they are in their negotiations with the Russians, which are more or less constant, sporadically in person, but pretty constant through, well, this type of video conferencing platform that we're using now, if they make concessions, would be actually persuading the Ukrainian people to accept them. Because this is an extremely heady moment for the Ukrainian people as far as, their self-identity as not Russia, and their sense of what can be done. And that's going to be a political challenge for Zelensky. As much as getting a negotiation off the ground and to a solution is going to be the biggest challenge, concessions, selling those to the Ukrainian people are going to be a real challenge too. So I think that probably what we're looking at is positional warfare for a fairly protracted period of time right now. We're seeing Russian forces dig in, literally entrenching around some of Kyiv, and it might be the case that they have hopes of encircling, cutting off Kyiv, and laying siege to it. At the end of the day, I really struggle to see that getting them a lot of even their significantly watered down war aims. So those would probably include things like Ukrainian recognition of Russia's illegal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, Ukrainian recognition of either the independence or annexation by Russia of those eastern Donetsk and Luhansk regions, on what borders would remain very much an open question. And then some kind of neutralization clause, whether that would be constitutional amendments or some other kind of mechanism. Those would probably be what the Russian negotiators are focusing on now, because they're not going to take Kyiv. Zelensky is there to stay, and the demonstration by the leaders of several NATO countries today flying into Kyiv is a really telling commentary on not only their resolve, but also the fact that Kyiv is still a functional and viable city. So as the Russians try to pause to a certain extent, I think we're going to see negotiations really pick up to see if there is a way that they can extract themselves from this situation on something approaching successful terms.
Absolutely, thank you. And I'm glad you transitioned to the talks, because Professor Jentleson, I wanted to ask you about that. You've written a lot about sanctions and about how they only really work when in concert with diplomacy. We're seeing some talks happen. And as you've mentioned in previous talks, there are always back-channel talks happening. How optimistic are you that the current talks that are ongoing could provide any kind of short-term relief to what's happening in Ukraine?
Yeah, I wouldn't say optimistic, but I don't preclude the possibility at all. And I think if we look at a number of things that are happening, so one is the meeting in Rome yesterday between National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and the top Chinese foreign policy diplomat, member of the Politburo there. Some of the press on that was, oh, nothing must have happened because there's no joint statement. I actually took the fact there's not a joint statement as a possible positive. The Chinese were not going to stand up in Rome and say, we've decided to cooperate with the Americans because they asked us to, or because they put pressure on us. I think Xi Jinping has seen that his, friendship with no limits was not the wisest thing to say on the eve of the Olympics. I think that, I think that there are a lot of dilemmas here for China, and there's a path here for China to play a role. There could be, as you were saying, Greg, some back channel aspects that we don't know about and we shouldn't know about. All sorts, whether they're officials of governments or unofficial people that have relationships. The key thing in the sanctions, and the sanctions have had, really unprecedented cooperation globally. Even as they say, the self-sanctioning by many companies, whether it's, consumer companies like IKEA and Nike, or financial giants like Goldman Sachs, or a whole variety of others going on. And if you contrast that, just as one example, with the international corporate opposition to the sanctions that we in the European Union have been trying to put on China because of the treatment of the Uyghurs, some call genocide. This is really quite extraordinary for companies to be taking this position. We've gotten cooperation from Japan and from South Korea. Korea is particularly important as a producer of some of those semiconductors that we want to sanction. So there's enormous pressure. The dilemma is that the economic impact of sanctions does not easily translate to policy change. Smaller countries, but look at Cuba or look at North Korea, or if you want to go back to the mid-1960s and white nationalist apartheid Rhodesia, which was one of the first countries to have full UN sanctions, held out for 15 years till it finally became Zimbabwe. The key in making that happen, I'm not convinced it's the oligarchs. I think for me, the real question, I'd love to hear Simon's view on this, again, without putting high percentages on this, but is the sort of is the Siloviki, I'll get it wrong, Simon, Siloviki, those surrounding Putin in the national security establishment. It's one thing to have President Macron at the end of a 20-foot table. It's another to do it to people and embarrass people who are key officials around you. Putin has a lot of insulation around him, but there's a real question in my mind as to whether or not Russian nationalists, who by no means want to see Ukraine join NATO, and it's important to understand that before this happened, there were many people that believed, not as a concession to Russia, but that Ukraine joining NATO was not good for European stability. In fact, CIA Director William Burns was ambassador to Russia in the mid-1990s, and one of his cables that he actually wrote about in his memoirs before going back into government talked about how almost everybody he talked to in the Russian national security establishment really opposed the idea of their neighbor Ukraine joining NATO. So is there a question in the minds, as a true Russian nationalist, not as a liberal, not even necessarily as the people on the street or the people breaking into TV studios with signs, that from the Russian nationalist point of view, this is being counterproductive? And is there pressure to be brought to bear internally through one form or another to help bring that about, which would set up the kind of negotiations that Simon was talking about, and that are a harder sell now than they would have been before? They seem like, over concessions, but there does need to be a diplomatic path that not just allows the Russians to save face, but addresses some of these core issues in European security. And whether it's a moratorium on Ukraine joining NATO, kicking it down the road, I think that may be more likely than an explicit statement that no, never. But I think that, I think that's going to have to be addressed in a serious way. And it really is important to remember that that was a contested issue before this happened. One of the paradoxes of Putin that makes it more likely that Ukraine might eventually come into NATO. But that issue has its own dynamics, before and potentially after this war hopefully ends.
So, Professor Miles, on the subject of negotiations, staying here, a couple of issues that I wanted to inject into your next comments is, number one, would Ukraine trust Russia in negotiations, given in the mid-90s, Ukraine was convinced to give up its nuclear weapons by the various nuclear powers, for guarantees of sovereignty? And then also, there are calls for Vladimir Putin and Russia to be charged with war crimes over their bombing of civilians. So do you see resistance in Ukraine to negotiation just because, A, they failed, those things haven't been upheld in the past, and B, they're going to want Russia to be held to account by the international community for some of the things that they're doing right now?
Let me take those in reverse order. So first, I'm obviously not a lawyer, but some of the strikes that we're seeing by the Russians, including using weapons like thermobaric rockets, which effectively ignite the air and suffocate, as well as burning, have no plausible military application, right? Whenever you get into these sorts of scenarios using what are often pretty horrific weapons, part of the question is there a military purpose to this, or are you just targeting civilians for the sake of trying to sort of break their will? And I think with a lot of these strikes on places like hospitals, there's reporting that right now the Russians have actually seized a hospital in southern Ukraine or are holding the patients and doctors hostage. These reports are obviously pretty sketchy because it's early minutes yet. Certainly are well outside the bounds of the norms of armed conflict. Now, the Ukrainians certainly would like to see Russians punished for this, but they also would like this to stop. And if the former is an obstacle to the latter, then I think we would see the Zelensky regime give ground on that. Furthermore, a lot of the key players are not going to be punished because they're probably not going to be leaving Russia at any time in the rest of their lives. To include Vladimir Putin, whose fingerprints are kind of all over this approach. And don't forget, this is not new. This is the same Russian leadership in many ways that obliterated the city of Grozny in Chechnya, which gave way to the brutal dictatorship of Ramzan Kadyrov, who now is actually in Ukraine fighting. So then we get to the question of Russian security guarantees. And here, I think the Ukrainians would be extremely wise to be skeptical of any pledge made by the current Russian regime. First and foremost, because they have broken such pledges in the past and will likely, be open to doing so again in the future. But also because I think when you look at Vladimir Putin talking about this issue, and he's given these speeches, he's made public remarks. So we actually have had a lot of opportunities to watch him. This is a man who is, I don't want to say whether he's rational or not, but he is not reasonable about this. He is clearly motivated by a deep-seated anger at the simple concept of Ukrainian statehood. I'm less persuaded that this is about NATO expansion than it is about Russia's relationship with Ukraine, which is a long, difficult history. And this is clearly an issue of acute passion for Vladimir Putin. So the fact that, for example, Russia violated the Bucharest Accords of 1994, whereby Ukraine gave up its weapons in exchange for a guarantee, that's been violated. I think the Ukrainians are going to have a really tough time accepting any kind of assurances from the current Russian leadership. Now, they may have no better option. But as Bruce said earlier, I think one of the ironies of this entire disaster has been that in many ways, Putin has gotten the opposite of what he wanted. He wanted a fractured West that was just squabbling over sanctions. He's gotten the opposite. He wanted Germany sitting on the sidelines. He's provoked a revolution in German foreign policy. He wanted Ukraine never in NATO, never in the European Union. I think both of those are very much fair game at this juncture.
And Professor Jentleson, I'd like to come back to you on that last point that Professor Miles just made. The beginning, before the invasion happened, everybody was talking about how, Ukrainian membership in NATO was a far-off possibility and very remote even at that. Do you think that both those things now, membership potentially of NATO and the European Union, are on the table for Ukraine?
They're more on the test. That's the irony, what I call the paradox, what Simon called the irony of this for Putin. So they're more on the table than they were before. I think my point was I agree with Simon on how deep this runs for Putin in his views of Russian history and a whole variety of other things. My point about a moratorium on NATO membership is more about the kind of diplomatic agreement that could be conceivably reached with those perhaps other than Putin, who again are Russian nationalists, but see that this has been counterproductive to Russian interest in so many ways, at home, abroad, economically, bringing the West together. making China rethink how close it wants to get to Russia. So my own view remains that if there can be, some form of assurances for Ukraine through NATO, through the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, a whole variety of diplomatic mechanisms, that I don't think NATO membership will lead to will lead to longer term stability in Central Europe, because then it becomes, well, what about Georgia, and what about Moldova? And I really don't see how any Russian nationalist, even one that is more constrained on using force, could really agree to that, in the short term or even in the medium or long term. So European Union could conceivably be a different story. The EU has a process for that. And that takes a while. They're not going to guarantee membership to Ukraine tomorrow, because that would put precedents for other countries like Turkey. So I think there's some flexibility there, but I still believe that that NATO membership for Ukraine would not contribute to sustainable, enduring stability in that region.
Thank you. Professor Miles, you have studied Russia for many years, and obviously over the last, especially over the last few months, there's been more speculation than ever about Vladimir Putin's state of mind and his decision making. What have you, in the last month or so, as this stuff has unfolded, what have you learned, do you think, about Vladimir Putin and his leadership that has been a surprise to you, or that's new information?
I think we've learned a few things. First and foremost, I think we've learned just how hollowed out the senior ranks of the Russian government have become because of the autocrats' impulse not to promote the best people, but rather to promote either the least risky from sort of a coup perspective, or to promote the most overtly loyal in order to reward them. And thus, with really the exception of macroeconomic policy, the Russian central bank, it's a pretty unimpressive roster of key figures who are around Vladimir Putin, who should be advising him, but I think we're seeing from a lot of how the war has played out from the early days, who have been sort of telling him what he wants to hear about the capabilities of the Russian military, about the weakness of the Ukrainian state, about the extent to which they have intelligence penetration of the Ukrainian state, and so on and so forth. So that's, I think, the first thing. We've seen this in autocratic regimes, so this isn't a surprise, but I think this has been confirmation that Bruce referenced the Siloviki, who are the kind of the power players around Putin, that a lot of the more competent ones have been pushed out. Those who remain, this brings me to my next point, do not seem enthusiastic about this war. And I think we talked about this before, but I am still struck by that first Security Council meeting, which was televised, at which Sergei Naryshkin, the head of the SVR, was publicly humiliated for all Russians to see on TV. How much these people who are commonly thought of as pushing in this direction looked utterly, utterly miserable. The third big point, I think, is, and the takeaway from that, let me just finish this thought. The takeaway from that is that I could see figures from that group who are by no means sort of liberal, pro-Western, Europhile reformers, recognizing that it's time to pull the emergency brake on this thing. A lot would have to happen between those events, though. The third point, I think, is that not only are authoritarian regimes not good at war fighting, but corrupt countries are not very good at war fighting. At the same time, we see Russian soldiers ransacking grocery stores to get food. We also see Russian army standard issue combat rations, the sort of eerily long shelf life type of foods, selling on eBay. So those foods these kinds of basic equipment are out there, but they're not in the hands of the people who are supposed to be using them. Finally, I think, and this is why I was skeptical that Putin would launch this invasion in the way that he did with such maximalist war aims is the extent to which he's really being driven by a pretty warped, very grievance-fueled sense of Russian history. He's been apparently reading a lot about Alexander III and Alexander I and Peter the Great. He's none of them. He's actually kind of Nicholas II blundering his way into World War I right now. That changes, I think, how we think about him as an actor, how we think about the really important nuclear escalation questions that Bruce raised earlier also.
Thank you. Professor Jentleson, I wanted to come back to the nuclear ladder that you mentioned and laid out. One of the things that's been proposed, Poland had fighter jets that it was willing to funnel to Ukraine through the US and NATO, which, the US has kind of stamped on that idea, at least for now. Is that because that's also seen as a step on the same ladder? Or what are some of the issues there with kind of going along with Zelensky's thing of, say, if you won't impose the no-fly zone, give us the planes and we'll do it ourselves?
Yeah, first of all, we have been providing an enormous amount of military aid to both to the formal Ukrainian army and to the informal what's really fighting is an insurgency. And by we, I mean the United States, Britain, Poland, Germany, France, one NATO member after another. So it's not like we're not providing military aid. We've been providing the kind that we believe, including some ground-to-air missiles that have been taking down Russian drones, inflicting casualties. It's hard to get an accurate casualty count, but even the lowest ones that have a degree of accuracy seem like the Russians have had as many casualties as we actually had in 20 years in Afghanistan, which is not to diminish the toll that Afghanistan took. So it's as well as the defections that Simon's talking about, and the like. So there's plenty going in. Every weapon system has its considerations about its utility as well. And I think some of these, somebody had put on the table, why don't we give them the Iron Dome like we give the Israelis? Those are really complicated. It takes a lot of training to learn how to use those and install them. And I think it's true of a lot of these jets. And that's where I think I'm a little, again, enormous praise for President Zelensky, profile and statesmanship all the way. But, when leaders go directly to the US Congress like this, I don't think it's particularly helpful to them. One might recall Prime Minister Netanyahu from Israel doing that in 2015 when the Obama administration was negotiating the Iran nuclear non-proliferation agreement. And it's going to heighten the appeal of aspects of this that make it look like the Biden administration is not supporting them. And that's not helpful to anybody. I think that's where I'm getting a little concerned, about sort of this new global heroism that Zelensky has. He needs to maintain, the bases for support and not try to change the politics to get things that the American leadership really wants to do as much as we can to keep the war out of a NATO country, because Biden has said that 1 inch in a NATO country, triggers the collective security agreement, and then we're really starting to climb that ladder. And I really think one of Putin's options when you're losing is to try to blow the whole house up, and whether it's going nuclear or going horizontal, if you win other countries. So I think that the administration is using good judgment on each particular weapon system, but the context that people have to remember is the enormous amount of aid that's being given, and it's been given on the basis of not just piling on the money, but what do we think is most helpful to the Ukrainians to resist the Russians at this point, and that manages the risks entailed of escalation.
Just 2 quick points on that, if I may. First, the big issue with those aircraft was that their radios and what's called Identify Friend or Foe, or IFF systems, that are in the Polish aircraft have been retrofitted to be interoperable with NATO. The Ukrainian equivalents of those aircraft do not have those new systems. So you would either need to source those systems, which is not easy for an old Soviet-made jet, or you would need to find a way to bridge them, which would probably be pretty kind of duct tape, shoestring, baling twine, etc. That's not the way that you want to go into a conflict. The other key point here is that the vast majority of Russian airstrikes are air-launched cruise missiles from outside Ukraine's borders. right? They're actually releasing them from their aircraft in Russia or Belarus, and then they strike in Ukraine. Sending Ukrainian fighters out to chase those down puts them into the Russian air defense network, which is a very different situation. They're getting huge mileage out of their surface-based air defense systems, and hopefully they'll continue to receive aggressive support in that vein. But those jets, there was really significant compatibility issues that would have made that a really challenging weapon to take on board for the Ukrainians.
One other point too, Greg, on the nuclear aspect of your question, when a crisis happens and it gets managed or resolved, sometimes over time it leaves less of an impact than ones that explode in our face. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, the invasion of Iraq, 9/11. We should not forget how close we came in the Cuban Missile Crisis to escalation to nuclear war. And there are some lessons there about how that was managed that still pertain, because sometimes people are saying, "Oh, we don't have to worry about the nuclear escalation. It never happened." And get a little personal. I was a little guy sitting on the living room floor with my parents when President Kennedy came on TV that night to talk to the American people about what was happening in this crisis. And I think I said something like, "Are we going to all die?" And they told me to go to bed, which I promptly did. But that cannot be underestimated, and it's hard to say that when people say, "Oh, it means there's humanitarian aspect," but that's really the responsibility we give to our top leadership in these situations, is to manage risk and determine how to weigh risks against opportunities.
Absolutely, thank you. And on a related subject, to stay with you, Professor Jentleson, we know that President Zelensky is supposed to address Congress tomorrow. What do you see as the ideal outcome of that, if there is even an ideal outcome from a U.S. perspective to that address?
Well, getting a little domestic political here, those aspects of the Trumpian wing of the Republican Party that started this crisis saying, A, what's in it for us? B, what's so bad about Putin? It's making it harder, at least for those in Congress, to hang in there with him. And maybe another lesson, including ways in which candidates that Trump is supporting in Republican primaries aren't doing so well, that might actually help my good friends in the Republican Party recapture their party. There will be applause. Everybody will be applauding for Zelensky, again, rightfully so. But I do think it will, push people both for their own belief. I want to be fair, for their own belief about what should be done strategically in this crisis, and for the politics, to make sure that, either that Biden doesn't get credit, or to be really Machiavellian about it, to push Biden into a decision that may actually backfire on Biden and the rest of us. So, I just haven't felt like, foreign leaders that get invited by Congress to come speak to Congress has rarely been very useful from what's the optimal foreign policy for the United States to have. So I actually, it'll be very dramatic, get a lot of TV coverage, but I don't think it's going to help figure out how to protect the Ukrainian people and how to get out of this crisis.
Understood. Thank you. Pivoting from the kind of domestic U.S. situation to the situation in Russia, Professor Miles, we've seen people leaving Russia apparently because of the devaluation of the currency. There was this extraordinary moment yesterday for an authoritarian regime where an employee at a news TV station kind of went on and made an on-air demonstration. How significant could this resistance within Russia to the war be to Putin's hold on power? How significant is it more broadly, do you think?
So I think the first thing that needs to be said is, while those moments make for great television and also demand enormous personal courage, the journalist who came on TV with that sign is in prison. The arrest numbers are in the thousands, and we have credible reports, including audio recordings of those protesters being brutalized in police custody, in addition to being beaten on the streets. Those are all great television moments, and so they dominate the headlines. But a lot of the public opinion polling, including by non-government opinion pollsters, that is to say ones that we think have reasonable accuracy, are indicating that somewhere around 60% of Russians support the current war in Ukraine. Now, they're doing that based on extremely dubious information being fed to them by the Russian state television networks, both of which are unambiguous propaganda wings of the Kremlin. But nevertheless, I think it would be inaccurate to characterize this as a kind of awakening of the Russian people or something like that, spurred on by this conflict about the evils of authoritarianism and Vladimir Putin in particular. So I don't hold out a great deal of hope, especially because all of those people who do hold those views, who can, are leaving the country. And so you have a kind of liberal flight, if you will, from Russia, as we see, 50,000 in Armenia, tens of thousands leaving through Finland, everywhere that they can. So that kind of avenue for a resolution to the crisis is not one in which I put a great deal of stock. Again, without detracting in the least from the enormous personal courage of the people, and there are thousands of them taking to the street. That's not going to swing how politics unfolds in a country where the police outnumbers the army, right? The extent to which Russia is a police state that is capable of brutal repression and is very willing to use that capability, I think, can't be underemphasized. Even within the kind of military sort of intelligence complex, we're seeing a lot of scapegoating is already starting. Senior FSB figures, according to credible but unconfirmed reports, under house arrest. This business about punishing anyone who erroneously sent conscripts into the fight has basically opened up the whole military also for retaliation for the poor performance. And so while those moments are powerful, I'm not sure that we should expect them to play out very far.
Sure, thank you. And ping-ponging back to the domestic situation in the US, Professor Jentleson, obviously at the moment we're seeing very high gas prices, which has a little to do with the situation in Russia. You kind of laid out, if you look at US consequences, and at the bottom is higher gas prices, and at the top is the top of the nuclear ladder that nobody wants to get to, what kind of real world impacts could we expect to the economy here in the US just as this thing continues to drag out? Are there other things that we should be looking for?
The global economy we keep seeing, we saw it during the pandemic, is so interdependent and interconnected. We've gotten used to the expression supply chain problems, and I think most people weren't using that 2+ years ago. So this is going to cascade through in a variety of ways. The Saudis and the United Arab Emirates have largely given us the cold shoulder about increasing their oil production because they have their own issues with us. The UAE wants access to the F-35s as part of the payoff, if you will, for starting to make peace with Israel. The Saudis, the president still has not interacted directly with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, he of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and many other aspects. So you kind of see all the different moving parts here in foreign policy. It's making the Federal Reserve's decisions much more complicated. It sure seemed like they were headed in the direction of raising interest rates to reduce inflation. Now they're beginning to be worried about a macroeconomic effect that could affect growth and employment, and so it's really confusing for them. But it really, during World War II, and this is not World War II, but my mother grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, in the Northeast, actually hometown of Joe Biden. And when she passed away a number of years ago, I still found in her belongings from when she was a 16-year-old girl a letter from the White House thanking her for her victory garden, right? The rationing this country went through in World War II was extraordinary. And there she was in northeastern Pennsylvania trying to grow fruit and vegetables as part of her victory garden during the war. We don't need anything like that. But frankly, the notion that gasoline prices going up at the pump are going to become a major issue in the United States. We really need to think about what that means for us when we tell the Europeans who are getting, 40% of their natural gas and I think 20% of their oil from the Russians that they should go cold turkey. There's reasons why they need to reduce their dependence on Russian supplies of oil and natural gas. I don't think down to zero, because it's always about diversification of your portfolio. And part of the reason they turned to the Russians was the instability in the Middle East. But I think that really is something that we as Americans should be thinking about. It. If this is as serious an issue as it is, and it is, some higher gas prices, we haven't had much greater effect on the American economy. And some notion of everybody being in this together in a small way can actually do really good for our national psyche. I don't want to get too preachy, but I think it's something that's worth having us really think more deeply about.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. We're about to wrap it up here, but I wanted to ask both of you, and Professor Miles, I'll start with you, where you think people who are following this should really be focusing their attention in the days and weeks to come. Is it the siege of Kyiv or in Ukraine? What should people be paying attention to as they try to figure out how this thing will unfold, the next chapter of it?
Well, I think certainly there are going to be the high-profile events, as Bruce mentioned, President Zelensky's speech in front of Congress, and his, pretty amazing rate of communication with world leaders, especially European leaders. He is definitely winning the information war. No surprise, given his professional background. I personally am going to be watching for one, whether the Russians are able to achieve an encirclement of Kyiv, which does put the Ukrainians in a militarily difficult position. I'm not saying that means that Russia rolls into the city. That just launches a phase of urban warfare, which is going to be brutal, to say the least. So that's the first question. I think it will be interesting to see if Putin is able to cajole Alexander Lukashenko, who is his client in Belarus, into joining the fight. That and a lot of what we're seeing about, bringing Syrians. These are all the moves of someone who is not doing well. These are coming from weakness, not strength. And if there are more of those types of maneuvers, I think that will give us a sense of just how much the Russian leadership themselves understand how badly this is going. And then the third big question that I'll be watching is this request that we've seen reporting on that the Russians have put in with the People's Republic of China for various types of military equipment, some sort of dual use, but some unambiguously, weapons that would be used to fight in Ukraine. I'm very curious about how much strain is being put on this relationship by the war in Ukraine. I think it's a lot. I was frankly never long on the Russia-China relationship, but I think that Xi feels burned by this and is not going to play ball, largely because in the eyes of the Chinese, they are the senior partner here. In the eyes of the Russians, they are the senior partner here. And that you're going to see some headbutting, I think, catalyzed by this.
Sure, thank you. Professor Jentleson, any closing thoughts or things that you're looking at in the days ahead?
I definitely think for the war on the ground, the siege of Kyiv is absolutely central. I agree with some of that. I'm actually going to be watching, I'm going to be watching the NATO borders, including for false flag operations and also for inadvertent activity. I think because Putin is doing so badly, I think he sees some interest in trying to test Western resolve and figuring even with some escalation he can't be doing any worse than he is now. Again, don't agree with that, but that may be his calculation. And then on the Chinese front, I agree. I think that Xi is facing his own effort this fall to become president for life, or at least a third term. His foreign policy hasn't been going very well even before this. He's been getting, he's been finding what, frankly, the United States found out in places like Iraq, what the Russians are finding out, that when great powers overextend, they get a lot of pushback. It's happening to him on his Belt and Road Initiative in lots of places around the world. It's been happening with countries in Asia. And again, this is not escalating here and being part of that. I don't see how it serves his interest. The enemy of my enemy may be my friend, But the enemy of my enemy could be my friend too. And I think from a Chinese, just like we were saying before about Russian leaders who are nationalists, not reformers, who may see need to put an end to this. China doesn't want America to get credit for this, so maybe there's a way that it can be part of an effort to reduce the crisis and the like. And that may take some time, and there may not be some preliminary reports, but it's an interesting aspect of the diplomacy that's not the only one, but worth keeping an eye on.
Absolutely. Thanks to you both. I think we'll leave it there. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, Professor Bruce Jentleson and Professor Simon Miles, for sharing your expertise. As always, we're holding regular briefings on the war and the pandemic and other issues. If you'd like to be on the list for future briefings, please email dukenews@duke.edu to let us know. In the meantime, please stay well and stay informed. Thanks and have a great day.